are reports that the forthcoming double album by the Beatles, expected later this year, may no longer carry the working title, A Doll's House. The change is believed to follow the recent release of Music in a Doll's House by a new group called Family, whose album bears a similar title. Oh, by the way, if anybody asks you which station...
The history of rock and roll is full of albums that didn't do well when they were originally released, but later became cult classics. Bands like the Velvet Underground or the Stooges, for instance, are good examples of that. But there's another kind of album that doesn't get talked about as much. Records that were also very influential, sometimes even ahead of their time, but for whatever reason never really got that second wave of recognition and have become a bit overlooked over the years. And one of those records is Music in a Doll's House, the debut album by Family. The record is widely regarded as one of the first progressive rock albums, and it's the sort of LP that captured a moment of transition when 60s psychedelia began to evolve into something more ambitious. Family never really broke through in the United States, but they achieved recognition in Britain, where several of their records reached the top 10 in the UK album charts. And the band would go on to influence many groups like Genesis and Jethro Tull, something both have acknowledged on several occasions. But unlike many pioneering records from that era, Music in a Doll's House was never widely rediscovered or re-evaluated, and it remains, even today, strangely overlooked. In this video, we're going to take a look at the history of this pioneering but often forgotten record. Let's begin. Family were formed in late 1966 in Leicester, out of the remaining members of a group previously known as the Farinas, and later the Roaring Sixties, whose sound was grounded in rhythm and blues and soul music. But just like many bands from that period, by 1967 they began moving towards a more experimental direction and embraced a more psychedelic type of sound. The group soon moved to London and changed their name to Family, a name suggested by American producer Kim Fowley, who was living in the UK at the time. During their early days in London, the group regularly wore double-breasted suits in performances, giving themselves a kind of mafia-style appearance. And this is why Kim Fowley suggested they call themselves The Family. However, the group soon abandoned that look in favour of a more casual dress code, but they decided to keep the name. Their shows in clubs like the Marquee quickly began attracting attention, and they built a reputation as one of the most promising new live bands in the city. So this led John Gilbert to become their manager and secure them a record deal with Liberty Records. Their first single was released in October 1967 and produced by Jimmy Miller, who at the time was famous for his production work with Traffic. Seen Through the Eye of a Lens was an excellent track that leaned into the more exploratory side of psychedelia. It already showed a band with personality, exploring a darker sound that wasn't really common at the time, and it seemed to predate the kind of dark atmosphere that would come to define King Crimson a couple of years later. Overall, I personally think that this is one of the best psychedelic singles from the second half of 1967. The B-side was another good song called Gypsy Woman.
Tell me, gypsy woman, tell me what you see in your crystal ball.
The single was well received by the press, with positive reviews in music papers such as The Melody Maker and the New Musical Express. And it even impressed John Lennon, who spoke very favourably about the group in an interview for the Daily Mirror in November 1967. But in spite of the positive reviews, the single didn't chart, and as a result, Liberty Records decided to drop the group. But Family were quickly becoming one of the most exciting live acts in London's psychedelic underground scene, and they were soon offered a new record deal with Reprise Records. Family began recording their first album in early 1968, with Jimmy Miller once again involved in production. However, Miller was busy working on Beggar's Banquet by the Rolling Stones and only found time to produce 2 tracks. So former Traffic member Dave Mason ended up taking over as the album's main producer. The LP was recorded at Olympic Studios with engineers Eddie Kramer and George Chkiunts assisting, and Mason was also joined by Mike Batt, who at the time was only 18 years old and contributed string and brass arrangements to 3 tracks. And as some of you might already know, Batt would later find success in the 70s as a member of the Wombles. In an interview a few years ago, Mike Batt remembered,
the family were all surrounded by glamorous women and stuff like that. And they all smelled of patchouli oil. The control room at Olympic was lined with beautiful women, all smelling of patchouli and looking dope. And I'm completely intimidated by all this. Anyway, I knew that Dave Mason was producing that session, the family sessions. And Dave Mason at the time was a big star. He was the leader of Traffic. And I was scared I was going to turn up and it was going to sound terrible. B, there was the intimidation of the fact that it was Dave Mason producing. And that was it. It was my first gig. I remember buying a baton on the way to Olympic Studios.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at the album track by track.
Feel like a fox, house close at heels at the chase.
The album opens with The Chase, a short and almost chaotic piece that immediately sets the tone. It features an excellent string arrangement by Mike Batt, which gives the track a baroque feel and adds to its tense atmosphere. And that tension is heightened further by falsetto harmonies, which recall the kind of sound that bands like Uriah Heep would popularize later in the 70s. It's a track that focuses more on atmosphere than melody, hinting at the album's experimental nature, and it works as a perfect opener.
Your lips that evade a crimson charade.
The Chase is followed by Mellowing Grey, another track featuring a strong string arrangement by Mike Batt. It's one of the more melodic moments on the album, but still very unconventional. The song blends gentle, almost pastoral sections with sudden shifts, creating that distinctly uneasy psychedelic feel that runs throughout the record. After the first two tracks, which are heavily dominated by strings, the third song on the album offers a change of pace and sound.
It's got you into these bright colored blocks. Lost mother still smiles in her little girl frock.
The song was written by Dave Mason, and it's the only track on the album not written by Family. It leans closer to traditional songwriting with a more accessible structure, but still carries that slightly off-kilter psychedelic mood. And in many ways, it wouldn't have sounded out of place on the first album by Traffic. The Dave Mason track is followed by Me, My Friend, a brief but excellent piece, quirky, theatrical, and full of personality. The song was released as a single to coincide with the release of the LP, and it's characterized by the use of studio techniques such as phasing effects. This is one of my personal favorites from the album. Me, My Friend is followed by a 20-second interlude called Variation on a Theme of Hey Mr. Policeman. These variations throughout the album help give it a loose and sweet-like structure, something that would later become a staple of progressive rock. And this interlude is followed by Winter, a darker and more introspective piece.
Winter time, it brings me down. Overcoats and scarves thrown round.
The mood is subdued and slightly eerie, reinforcing that sense of emotional depth and ambiguity that separates this album from brighter psychedelia. Winter is followed by Old Songs, New Songs, one of the album's standout tracks, which became a moderate hit in France, where it was released as a single in late 1968. The song blends psychedelic elements with a more rhythm and blues-influenced feel, and features brass arrangements by Mike Batt. In an interview a few years ago, Batt remembered,
So the strings left, and I was quite happy with what I'd done. It was amazing. I was, not euphoric, but at least, that went okay. So in come the brass, and it turns out that not that I knew until someone told me, the leader of the sax section was Tubby Hayes, and There's a song called Old Songs, New Songs, which we started, which was the session. What the family had asked for was 4 big major chords at the beginning of the piece, and then do what I like, build it up into a big sort of nightclub sort of atmosphere, big city type of sound for the fade out at the end. And so I brought up this brand new baton, brought it down again, and this horrendous noise came out. It wasn't a major chord, it was some sort of weird major ninth that I'd accidentally written because I'd forgotten to transpose the B flat instruments in the brass section. So all of the saxes were wrong, the E flat instruments, the baritones. The thing that was good that happened was Tubby Hayes, contrary to the kind of musician that you just described, which was, i.e., why are we lowering ourselves to these brass musicians? They realised I wasn't. I don't know, for some reason they saw that I wasn't. Well, they were just nice guys, I suppose, because he just said, "Leave it to us, and we'll sort it for you. We'll just play it in the right key." So they just transferred it. And it saved my life. It saved my skin.
The A-side ends with another brief interlude, and the B-side opens with one of my favourite tracks on the album, Hey Mr. Policeman.
Mr. Policeman, 1 minute bill.
The song combines catchy, hook-driven elements with a slightly surreal, offbeat tone, balancing a kind of swaggering soul feel with psychedelic undertones, and this track is followed by another highlight. See-Through Windows is one of the strongest songs on the album, and a big favourite among many fans of the band.
Eyes, sing, lights, meaning.
It builds gradually, with a more hypnotic feel, and it shows Family's ability to create atmosphere through repetition and subtle shifts. And the track is further highlighted by some wonderful mellotron touches, which once again recall the sort of sound that King Crimson would popularise a year later on their first album. After another 20-second interlude, the album continues with Peace of Mind. It's one of the more straightforward songs on the record, but still carries unusual textures and a darker undertone, enhanced by bassist Rick Grech playing violin. The track has a more grounded and folky feel, offering a moment of relative clarity within the album's more abstract passages, but it still reflects the darker edge that separated Family from much of late 60s psychedelia. And this is one of the 2 tracks on the album that were co-produced by Jimmy Miller. After Peace of Mind, and as its own title suggests, Voyage leans into the journey aspect of psychedelia, with shifting moods and a more expansive structure highlighted by some beautiful but at the same time unsettling mellotron touches. The record continues with The Breeze, the second track on the album to feature Jimmy Miller as producer.
Blown the dust from Sphinx's smiles, scattering sense for miles and miles.
This is by far the most whimsical song on the album. It's light, calm, and very melodic, and it contrasts nicely with the darker material, revealing another side of the band's sound.
Nobody knows, nobody sees.
And the record ends with a strong final track. The song brings together many of the album's elements, unusual structure, shifting dynamics, and a slightly surreal tone, ending the record on a note that feels unresolved but intentional.
Now looking back, there's nothing I regret.
Music in a Doll's House was released in July 1968, and its title would end up having an indirect connection to the Beatles. The Beatles had reportedly been considering A Doll's House as a working title for what became the White Album, but after Family released their album, the idea was dropped. The record also had some notable industry significance. It was the first album by a British rock band to be released on the US Reprise label, which was originally founded by Frank Sinatra and later owned by Warner Brothers. In the US, it initially circulated as an import before receiving a domestic release, often with additional packaging elements like inserts and sleeve stiffeners. As mentioned previously in the video, Family enjoyed a fair amount of success in Britain, with many of their albums entering the UK albums chart. However, the group never broke through in America, probably because their sound was too British, and that is likely one of the reasons why both the band and this album in particular have become a bit overlooked over the years. And as a result, it has not always been recognized as a landmark recording that bridged psychedelia with the progressive style that would become more prominent in the early 1970s. And therein lies another reason why the album has remained somewhat overlooked. Music in a Doll's House contains many elements of late 60s psychedelia, but at the same time it feels quite different from much of the music associated with that scene, as it also points forward to several characteristics that would later become associated with progressive rock. The result is that it doesn't sit neatly in either category. For some progressive rock listeners, it can feel too rooted in psychedelia, while for fans of 60s psychedelia, it feels too much like a prog rock album. In the end, Music in a Doll's House remains a fascinating snapshot of a moment in transition. A record that sits between two worlds, too unconventional for mainstream psychedelia, but too rooted in its time to be fully absorbed into the later prog rock canon. And perhaps that's exactly why it's been overlooked. Not because it lacked ambition or influence, but because it never quite fit into the categories that came after it. Still, when you listen to it today, it's hard not to hear how forward-thinking it was for 1968, and how much of what would follow was already beginning to take shape here. So Music in a Doll's House isn't just an overlooked album, it's one of those records that helped define what rock music was about to become.